Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, and keep up with our latest horror chilling stories.
A majestic snow-capped peak in Northern California is known for its stunning beauty, but beneath its serene surface lies a dark history of strange occurrences. For years, hikers, climbers, and even locals have reported unsettling experiences in the area, with many attributing them to the supernatural. However, one particular tale stands out, not for its mythical creatures or ghostly apparitions, but because of the inexplicable horror that gripped a group of hikers in the mountains one cold autumn night. It was in 1982 when a group of 5 experienced climbers decided to scale the rugged trails of Mount Shasta. The group was composed of seasoned hikers, each familiar with the terrain and aware of the mountain's unpredictable weather. As the sun began to set on their second day of the trek, they found themselves at a remote campsite halfway up the mountain. There were no signs of other hikers around. The wind howled through the trees, and the temperature dropped sharply as night fell. The group set up camp, lit their fire, and sat down to eat. But as the fire crackled, a sense of unease settled over them. They couldn't quite put their fingers on it, but something felt wrong. As darkness enveloped the mountain, the wind grew louder, carrying with it a strange, eerie hum. It was as if the mountain itself was alive, whispering in a language none of them could understand. One of the climbers, Mark, an amateur photographer, decided to venture out a bit and capture some shots of the surrounding landscape under the moonlight. He was gone for only 20 minutes, but when he returned to camp, his face was pale, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. Mark was usually calm and collected, but tonight he was shaken. He couldn't explain it. There was something out there, something that had been watching him. He described seeing strange, shadowy figures moving among the trees and heard whispers that seemed to follow him, growing louder the further he went. At first, the others thought he was merely spooked by the isolation, but soon they began to hear things as well. Soft footsteps in the snow, twigs snapping in the distance, and faint, almost imperceptible whispers that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. The group grew uneasy, huddling closer to the fire. Around midnight, one of the climbers, Sarah, went to retrieve her backpack from a small rock outcrop nearby. When she didn't return after a few minutes, the group called out for her. The silence was unnerving. They rushed to the spot where she had been, but there was no sign of Sarah, not even a footprint in the snow. Panic set in as they searched frantically, but it was as if she had vanished into thin air. Hours passed, and the group, now terrified, realized they were not alone. Strange sounds filled the night air, whispers, the rustling of something large, moving through the forest, and an overwhelming feeling that something was lurking just beyond their sight. Every time they looked around, it felt as if the shadows were shifting, closing in on them. By dawn, Sarah had still not been found, and the group, in a state of sheer panic, made their way down the mountain, constantly checking over their shoulders. They called for help once they reached a ranger station, but when the rescue team went back up the mountain, no trace of Sarah or any sign of what had happened could be found. No footprints, no personal items, not even a broken twig to indicate she had been there. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened that night on Mount Shasta. Some believe the group encountered something otherworldly, perhaps a spirit of the mountain or an ancient creature, while others suspect the unexplainable isolation and fear of the wilderness played tricks on their minds. But one thing is certain. The mountains, with all their beauty, hide many dark secrets. And for those brave, or foolish enough to venture into the heart of their wilderness, there may be things waiting that no human should ever encounter. As the rescue team returned, without answers, the horror of that night began to seep into the town below Mount Shasta. The hikers who had survived the ordeal tried to explain what happened, but the more they spoke about it, the more incoherent their accounts became. It was as if the mountain had warped their sense of reality, leaving them with fragmented memories and a deep, lingering fear that they couldn't shake. One of the climbers, Mark, was never the same after that night. He tried to return to his normal life, but he would often stare into the distance, lost in thought, as if something was still calling to him from the mountains. He began to suffer from vivid nightmares, waking up in cold sweats, whispering words he couldn't even remember. Every so often he would mumble about her, Sarah. He would speak of seeing her, but not as the person she once was. In his dreams, Sarah was different, her face distorted, her eyes empty, as though she had become a part of the mountain itself. Mark wasn't the only one plagued by these horrors. The others tried to return to their lives as well, but the memories of that night followed them like a shadow. One by one, they all began to suffer from strange occurrences. A few weeks after the hike, Sarah's body was never found, and yet one of the climbers, Lisa, swore she saw her in the town, staring from a window of an abandoned cabin on the outskirts. When Lisa went to investigate, the cabin was empty, and there were no footprints in the snow, only a lingering coldness that seemed to radiate from the building itself. She felt a strange pull to the cabin, but when she stepped inside, the air was thick, oppressive, as if something or someone had been waiting for her. Even the ranger who had helped search the mountain was affected. He had been a veteran of the mountain for over 20 years. But after that incident, he began to act erratically. He would often disappear for days at a time, hiking up the mountain without informing anyone, only to return with a faraway look in his eyes. When questioned, he would mutter about the mountain calling him, about seeing things that weren't there, and about Sarah, how she had begged him to come closer, to follow her into the darkness. But the most chilling part of the story was what the rescue team discovered after the hikers left. Upon returning to the site where the group had camped, they found something that sent shivers through their spines. The campsite had been undisturbed, except for one small detail, a single footprint, perfectly formed in the snow, but it was much larger than a human's. It was as if something had been watching them from the trees, something not human, its massive foot leaving an impression in the snow. The footprint was half frozen, but no one had seen anyone else in the area the entire time the rescue team had been up there. As the years passed, the story of the missing climbers faded from the public eye, becoming just another eerie tale of Mount Shasta's wilderness. But there were whispers, rumors of hikers who had ventured into the area, never to return. Some claimed to have heard strange sounds in the night, or seen unexplainable shadows darting between the trees. Others swore they felt an oppressive presence, as though the mountain itself was alive, watching, waiting for something or someone to return. In 1993, a group of paranormal investigators came to Mount Shasta, hoping to uncover the truth behind the mysterious happenings. Armed with high-tech equipment, they set up camp near the site where the climbers had vanished. As the sun set, the temperature dropped sharply, and the wind began to howl. The investigators, skeptical but curious, began recording strange fluctuations in their equipment. The radio static was unlike anything they had heard before, distorted, as if the mountain itself was speaking. Then, at midnight, the first investigator vanished. He had been standing by the fire, speaking into his recorder, when the others looked away for only a moment. When they turned back, he was gone. No sign of a struggle, no footprints leading away from the camp. The remaining team members searched frantically, but there was no trace of him. What followed was even more disturbing. Over the next 2 days, the rest of the team began to experience vivid hallucinations. One investigator, Jane, reported seeing a figure, tall, thin, and cloaked in tattered black robes, stalking the edge of the forest. She said it had no face, just a void where its features should have been. Another investigator, Tom, was found in a daze, muttering nonsensically about a mountain god who demanded sacrifices. The team left Mount Shasta in a hurry, their mission unfinished. They never spoke about what happened in the mountains again, and the footage they had gathered was mysteriously lost. Now, many years later, the town of Mount Shasta remains quiet. But those who have ventured into the wilds of the mountain still tell the story of the climbers who vanished, of the unnatural whispers in the wind, and of a presence that watches from the shadows. No one knows what really happened on that fateful night in 1982. But one thing is certain. Something lives in the heart of Mount Shasta. Something ancient, something waiting. And for those brave enough to seek the truth, it may be the last thing they ever do. As time wore on, the legend of Mount Shasta only grew darker. The townspeople, though outwardly welcoming, seemed to share a silent, unspoken understanding about the mountain's cursed nature. Newcomers to the area often heard strange tales from locals in the small, dimly lit diners or over warm mugs of coffee. But no one ever ventured too far into the wilderness without hearing whispers of the past, about the vanished climbers, the eerie shadows, and the feeling that the mountain itself was alive. In 2001, another group of hikers, all from different parts of the country, decided to test their mettle and embark on a journey to the summit of Mount Shasta. They were thrill seekers, adventurers looking to conquer one of the highest peaks in Northern California. Each one had read the legends surrounding the mountain, but most dismissed it as superstition. After all, they were experienced climbers and had dealt with far more dangerous conditions on other mountains. But on the first night of their trek, as they set up camp near the same spot where the 1982 hikers had disappeared, something felt off. One of them, Jake, was the first to feel the unease. The moment he stepped out of the tent to relieve himself, he noticed the stillness of the air. No wind, no sounds of animals, not even the usual rustle of branches. There was only an eerie, oppressive silence. He shrugged it off, telling himself it was just the isolated environment playing tricks on him. That night, they gathered around the campfire, cracking jokes and sipping on warm drinks to ward off the mountain's cold. But as the flames danced, the ground beneath them seemed to rumble, faint but noticeable. It was a vibration that seemed to come from the depths of the mountain itself. They all paused, looking at each other. Probably just a small tremor, one of the climbers, Sarah, said dismissively. This area is known for earthquakes, right? They resumed their conversation, but as the night wore on, the vibrations grew more distinct, as though the mountain was alive and moving beneath them. The fire flickered violently, casting long, grotesque shadows that stretched across the campsite. For a moment, one of the climbers swore he saw a figure, tall and gaunt, standing just outside the firelight. When he blinked, the figure was gone. Forest was eerily silent, and no trace of Marcus could be found. In their search, they stumbled upon something that made their blood run cold, a set of massive footprints. The prints were too large to belong to a human, too deep and wide to be from any animal they could recognize. They seemed to go off the trail and into the dense woods, but they ended abruptly, as if Marcus had simply vanished into thin air. The group was torn between fear and disbelief. Could it be the same thing that had taken the 1982 hikers? But this time, the mountain's wrath seemed more deliberate, more patient. It wasn't just an incident. It was a pattern, one that seemed to repeat itself whenever the mountain was disturbed. The climbers made the desperate decision to leave. They packed up their things in a hurry, but as they tried to descend the mountain, they realized something terrible. The trail they had followed to reach their camp had disappeared. The path was gone, swallowed by an unnatural fog that had rolled in, thick and impenetrable. The only sound was their own hurried breaths and the strange rhythmic thrum from deep within the mountain. It was as though the mountain was closing in around them, trapping them in its clutches. For days they wandered in the fog, each step feeling more futile than the last. The more they searched for an escape, the further they seemed to be from any familiar landmarks. The air grew colder, and their food and water supplies dwindled. At times they thought they heard faint cries, echoes, of lost souls who had wandered too far. Their minds began to fracture under the stress. Then, on the fourth day, something happened that none of them would ever be able to explain. While huddling near a small rock formation, exhausted and on the brink of collapse, one of the climbers, Anna, heard a voice. At first, she thought it was a figment of her imagination, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation. But the voice was clear, almost whispering, and it spoke in a language that none of them could understand. It was then that she saw it. A massive, shadowy figure standing at the edge of the trees, its form barely visible through the mist. The figure was tall, taller than any human could be, and its features were obscured by an unnatural darkness. It was as if the mountain itself had taken shape and was watching them. Panic gripped Anna's heart as the figure seemed to move closer, though it made no sound. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, hovering just above the ground. In the fog, it looked almost like a wraith, its outline shifting and changing as if it were made of the very mist around them. The voice spoke again, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill through Anna's bones. She was frozen, unable to speak or move. The others were too far gone in their fear to notice her reaction. But then, something broke through the fog. A figure appeared. It was Marcus, alive but different. His eyes were wide, glazed over with an eerie, vacant stare, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. He stood there swaying slightly, as though under the influence of something beyond human understanding. He reached out to them, but when they tried to approach, his arm jerked backward with unnatural speed. "Don't," he whispered in a voice that sounded like it was coming from a distant, dark place. "It's not the mountain. It's her. She's calling us." With that, Marcus turned, his body jerking unnaturally, and walked into the fog, vanishing before their eyes. The group never spoke of the incident again. They managed to stumble back to the town, broken and haunted by what they had seen. The authorities found no evidence of Marcus, no body, no trace. It was as if he had become part of the mountain, swallowed whole by whatever dark force haunted its depths. After that, people stopped visiting Mount Shasta. The stories grew even darker, whispered by those who remembered the climbers, the hikers, and the strange disappearances. Many spoke of the She, the entity that lived deep within the mountain, an ancient, malevolent force that devoured anyone who dared disturb its peace. But no one really knew. Some believed it was an ancient spirit of the mountain, perhaps a long-forgotten god that had once ruled over the land. Others thought it was something far darker, something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to reclaim its territory. One thing was certain, though. Mount Shasta was not simply a mountain. It was alive, and it hungered. Story 2. In the rugged hills of Victoria, Australia, Mount Hotham stood as a towering, untouched wilderness, a place that beckoned adventurers and climbers with its steep slopes and majestic vistas. However, in the late 1970s, it became infamous for an event that left the locals in fear and the mountaineering community unsettled. It started with a group of 5 young climbers, Alex, Julie, Ben, Sarah, and Tom, who were eager to test their skills and tackle the formidable peak of Mount Hotham in the middle of winter. They had trained for months, preparing for the harsh, icy conditions and the unpredictable weather that the mountain was known for. But as they packed their gear, none of them knew that they would become part of a mystery that would haunt the mountain forever. The group arrived at the base of the mountain early in the morning, greeted by an overcast sky that seemed to promise snow. The air was thick and cold, and the wind carried a strange, unsettling energy, almost as if it were warning them to turn back. But their excitement overshadowed any unease they might have felt. They set out on their ascent with no particular destination in mind except the summit, where they hoped to camp for the night. But soon after reaching the lower slopes, something strange began to happen. The clouds grew darker, the wind picked up, and the atmosphere felt charged, almost unnatural. As they climbed, they found themselves veering off the trail they had planned to follow, though none of them could explain why. The terrain seemed to shift beneath their feet. Paths they thought they had already crossed would suddenly appear again, as though the mountain was playing tricks on them. Tom, the most experienced among them, began to feel uneasy. "Something's not right," he murmured, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to see someone or something following them. The others shrugged it off, attributing his unease to fatigue. By mid-afternoon, the weather took a violent turn. A blizzard set in, enveloping the mountain in thick snow and biting winds. Visibility dropped to near zero, and they were forced to find shelter under an outcropping of rocks. Huddling together, they tried to stay warm and wait out the storm. But it felt as if the mountain was trying to keep them there, trapping them in its cold embrace. Hours passed, and the blizzard showed no signs of letting up. The snow piled higher, burying their tents and equipment, and the temperature plummeted dangerously low. It was then that they noticed something even stranger. One of the climbers, Sarah, went to check the map, but when she opened it, she found that the mountain's features were completely different. The peaks, the ridges, the trails, they were unrecognizable. The map had changed. Panic began to seep in. "What is this? This isn't our map!" she cried, her voice shaking. The others crowded around her, staring at the map in disbelief. The contours of the mountain seemed to have shifted, as though the very landscape had been altered while they weren't looking. Tom tried to remain calm, but even he couldn't ignore the overwhelming sense that they were no longer in the place they had intended to. That night, as they sat huddled together in the dark, the snowstorm outside howled like a living beast. The wind rattled the rocks above them, and then silence. The eerie calm that followed felt unnatural, as if the storm had paused for a reason. Suddenly they heard something, a low, guttural sound, a moaning noise coming from the depths of the mountain. At first they thought it was just the wind, but then it grew louder, closer. It was a voice, but it wasn't human. It was a call, one that sounded ancient, filled with sorrow and longing. It seemed to echo from beneath the mountain. When the rescue team arrived days later, they found nothing. No bodies, no signs of the climbers, just the emptiness of Mount Hotham, as cold and silent as ever. The local legends tell of the mountain's curse, that those who climb too high or wander too far are never seen again. It is said that the mountain is alive, cursed by an ancient, vengeful spirit, one that has trapped souls in its fog for centuries. And as for the climbers, no one knows what happened to them, but some say they are still there, lost within the mountain's shifting fog, eternally wandering, trapped in the unchanging landscape of Mount Hotham, waiting for the next unwitting traveler to step into its grasp, for the mountain calls. And once you hear it, you may never leave. The story of the 5 climbers who vanished on Mount Hotham never truly faded from the local consciousness. The town below the mountain whispered about it, and the legend only seemed to grow with each passing year. Every winter, when the first snow began to fall, old-timers would warn travelers to stay away from the peak. But the legend had also drawn curiosity. Many climbers, skeptics, and thrill-seekers still ventured to Mount Hotham, dismissing the stories as nothing more than folklore. In the spring of 1985, a new group of climbers arrived, this time a more seasoned team, eager to unravel the mystery of the lost hikers. Among them was a man named Greg, a journalist with a reputation for uncovering the truth behind myths. He had heard the stories of the vanishing climbers and believed it was just a tragic series of accidents, twisted by time and local superstition. His goal was to document the true events of what happened on Mount Hotham, to give the real story to the world. Greg was joined by his team of 3 others: Laura, a skilled mountaineer, David, a photographer, and Rachel, an experienced survivalist. They were determined, practical, and well prepared, but they had no idea how unprepared they truly were for the horrors that awaited them. They set out at dawn, heading towards the base of the mountain, where the previous climbers had started their ill-fated journey. The weather was calm that morning, with no sign of the blizzards that had struck the earlier group. Greg's team made excellent progress, and by the time they reached the halfway point of their climb, they were feeling confident. They camped that night just a few hours from the summit, eager to finish the ascent the following day. As the night wore on, the weather began to shift. A low, unnatural fog rolled in over the mountain, thickening by the minute. It was unlike anything the climbers had experienced before. There was no wind, no natural movement in the air. The mist hung heavy in the air, oppressive and dense. Soon the entire campsite was shrouded in the fog, and the mountain seemed to become unnervingly quiet. Laura, the most experienced climber in the group, was the first to notice something was wrong. The stars, which had been clearly visible just hours earlier, had vanished behind a veil of dark clouds. The temperature had dropped rapidly, and there was a strange, distant hum that seemed to resonate from deep within the mountain. She had heard of these strange phenomena before, but only in the most remote corners of the world. There was something, not right here, something ancient and alive, lurking beneath the mountain's surface. "Greg, we should get moving. This fog, it's unnatural," she said, her voice tinged with worry. Greg, the pragmatic journalist, laughed it off. "Come on, Laura. It's just a storm. We've climbed far worse conditions. There's no need to panic." But deep down, Greg knew something had shifted. The longer they stayed on the mountain, the more uncomfortable he became. The air seemed to press down on him, and his skin crawled with an eerie sensation that something was watching them. Later that night, after a tense dinner by the fire, Rachel suggested they sleep in shifts, just in case the storm worsened. The group agreed reluctantly, though they all secretly hoped the mist would clear by morning. Hours passed, and the quiet was only interrupted by the occasional rustling of the tent fabric or the sound of a twig snapping underfoot. But then, as if from nowhere, a sharp scream pierced the silence. David was gone. The others rushed out into the fog, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. No footprints in the snow, no broken branches, not even a single trail that might indicate where he had gone. Only the sound of that eerie hum echoing faintly through the fog. It was as though the mountain had swallowed him whole. Rachel, who had remained calm up until now, was visibly shaken. "This isn't right. Something is happening here, something we can't explain." Greg, still skeptical, tried to keep his composure. "We need to stay focused. We'll find him. He can't have gone far." But they didn't find him. Instead, they found something far more terrifying. The next morning, the group set off in search of David. The fog had grown even thicker, and the cold was biting. After hours of searching, they stumbled upon a place they had never seen before. A strange, hollowed-out rock formation, almost like an entrance to an underground cave, though it seemed more like an unnatural opening in the earth itself. At the entrance, there were faint, freshly disturbed footprints leading inside, but they did not belong to any of them. The prints were huge, far too large to be human. Greg's heart began to race. This wasn't just an ordinary mountain. There was something alive in it, something old, something that had been waiting for them. They hesitated, but Rachel urged them on. "We need to go in. David might be in there. He might be alive." Against their better judgment, they entered the cave. Inside, the air was thick, stifling, and the further they went, the more the walls seemed to pulse, as if the mountain itself were breathing. It was a narrow passage at first, but it widened into a massive underground cavern. And that's when they saw it. At the far end of the cavern was an ancient altar, surrounded by strange symbols carved into the rock, glowing faintly in the dark. And there, lying on the altar, was David, or what was left of him. He was unrecognizable. His skin had turned an unnatural shade of pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were wide open, yet unseeing, glazed over in a way that made Greg's stomach churn. His body had been twisted unnaturally, as if he had been contorted by something beyond the physical world. But that wasn't the worst part. As Greg stared at David's lifeless form, he heard it. The voice. The same voice from before. The voice calling from deep within the mountain. The one that had lured David to the cavern, and it spoke their names. Greg turned to look at his team, their faces pale with fear. The mountain was alive, and it was waiting for them. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and the walls seemed to crack and shift. The air grew dense, oppressive. The mountain wasn't just a place. It was a sentient force that had been alive for centuries, feeding off the souls of the lost climbers who had come before. Suddenly, the ground opened up beneath them. Greg and Laura were sucked into a crevasse, plummeting into the depths of the mountain, while Rachel disappeared into the fog. The last thing Greg saw before he lost consciousness was the vast, endless chasm opening beneath him, swallowing everything, even the light. When the rescue team arrived days later, they found no trace of the climbers. There were no bodies, no footprints. Only the fog that seemed to roll endlessly from the depths of the mountain. It was as though the mountain had claimed them, just as it had claimed so many before. And the worst part? The fog still comes back every winter. And the whispers? They can still be heard, calling to the lost souls who dare to climb too high. The peak of Mount Hotham remains a mystery, one that not even the most experienced climbers dare to solve. Those who go up rarely return, and those who do speak of, seeing things, shadows, figures, and voices that call them to the depths. It's said that the mountain remembers, that it waits, and it will never let go of those who walk too far into its mist. The years after the disappearance of Greg's team passed in eerie silence. Mount Hotham became a place avoided by most, with only the bravest or most foolish daring to venture into its clutches. Whispers of the mountain's strange power had spread far beyond the local area, turning it into something of a cursed place in the mountaineering community. However, there were still those drawn to the mystery, those who believed the mountain's secrets had not been fully uncovered, and that the truth was waiting for someone brave enough to solve it. In 1994, a new group of climbers decided to take on Mount Hotham, determined to discover the truth behind the mountain's eerie legend once and for all. Among them was Neil, a veteran climber who had spent his life investigating the supernatural, and his team, Amanda, a geologist, Ethan, a psychic with a reputation for communicating with lost spirits, and Derek, a photographer interested in documenting what he believed would be an ancient, undiscovered relic of the past. Together, they set out to unravel the terrifying mystery of the vanishing climbers. They began their ascent in the early hours of the morning, unaware that this journey would not only uncover the forgotten history of the mountain, but also awaken something dark and ancient that had been lying dormant for centuries. As they made their way up the slopes of Mount Hotham, Neil and his team immediately noticed something unsettling. The air was heavy with a strange charge, electric, almost alive. The landscape around them felt oddly stagnant, as though the mountain itself was holding its breath. The further they climbed, the more the ground beneath them seemed to hum with energy, as if the very earth was vibrating with a hidden power. "We're getting close," Neil muttered, eyes scanning the misty surroundings. "I can feel it." By the time they reached the base of the mountain's upper ridge, they could see the fog creeping in from the valley below, moving with unnatural speed. The same fog that had swallowed previous climbers, the same fog that obscured the truth about the mountain. The team set up camp, determined to push on the next morning. But just like the others before them, they would soon learn that Mount Hotham was not simply a peak to be climbed. It was a living entity that could not be tamed. That night, the fog rolled in thick and fast, smothering the camp in a ghostly blanket. The wind howled through the trees, but there was no sound of life. The usual chorus of animals had fallen silent. As they huddled around the fire, an uneasy feeling settled over them, each person unable to fully shake the sense that they were being watched. Ethan, the psychic, had been eerily quiet throughout the night, his eyes distant. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and strained. "I can feel them. The spirits. They're restless." The others exchanged uneasy glances. Ethan had been known for his sensitivity to energies and spirits, but they had always chalked it up to his natural ability. Until now. He looked pale, his face drawn tight with fear. He continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're trapped here. The mountain, it doesn't want them to leave, and it won't let us leave either." Amanda, the geologist, scoffed nervously. "Come on, Ethan, this is just superstition. We're safe here. We've seen nothing unusual." But Neil, sensing that something was deeply wrong, stood up. "I've heard enough. We're not turning back. We'll go up tomorrow." The next day, the team pushed forward despite the mounting tension. As they neared the summit, the fog grew thicker, and the ground beneath their boots felt less stable. A strange vibration was now emanating from the earth, much stronger than before. Each of them could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down on them, its power seeping into their bones. When they reached the summit, they found something unexpected, an ancient stone structure half buried in the snow. It was a circle of stones, arranged in a perfect, almost ritualistic manner. Strange symbols were carved into the rocks, and in the center of the circle lay an altar made of dark, weathered stone. Ethan recoiled at the sight, his face twisted in terror. "This is it," he whispered. "This is the source. This is where—" It all began. The others gathered around, unsure of what to make of the sight. It was clear that the stone circle wasn't a natural formation. Someone had built it long ago for reasons that were now lost to time. But as they stood there, the temperature began to plummet rapidly, and an unsettling silence filled the air. Then, just as they were about to turn back, Amanda noticed something strange. The ground beneath the stone circle seemed to ripple, like the surface of water disturbed by an unseen force. The symbols etched into the stones began to glow faintly, their ancient script shifting and twisting before their eyes. Before they could react, the air exploded with a violent burst of sound, like 1,000 voices whispering all at once. It was a cacophony of unintelligible words, rising and falling in pitch, as though the mountain itself was speaking. Ethan dropped to his knees, clutching his head in pain, while Derek fumbled with his camera, his hands shaking as he tried to record. The phenomenon, Neil stood frozen, his mind racing, realizing that they had unwittingly triggered something ancient, something malevolent that had been dormant for centuries. "It's awake," Neil muttered under his breath. "We've woken it." In that instant, the mountain shook. A deep, rumbling tremor vibrated through the ground, and a gust of freezing wind whipped through the summit, knocking everyone off their feet. The stone circle began to pulse with a dark energy, its glow intensifying. And then, something began to emerge. From the very heart of the stone circle, a shape began to rise, something vast, shadowy, and formless. It was as if the fog itself was taking shape, growing larger and darker, coalescing into a towering figure that seemed to loom over them like a nightmare. The shadows of lost climbers, those who had ventured to Mount Hotham before and never returned, took form within the mass. Their hollow eyes and twisted faces stared down at the team, their mouths opening in silent screams. The figure spoke, not with words but with a feeling, a deep, oppressive presence that filled their minds with terror, telling them that they had disturbed the mountain's slumber and were now bound to it forever. The shadows reached out, their cold, ethereal hands closing in on the group, and one by one, they began to disappear into the darkness. Derek screamed as his camera slipped from his hands, and Amanda was pulled toward the altar, her body convulsing as the mountain consumed her. Ethan tried to fight it off, but he was overwhelmed by the force that surrounded him, his body becoming a part of the fog itself. Neil, with his last ounce of strength, looked back at the summit. His teammates were now nothing more than empty, soulless husks, trapped forever within the mountain. With a final desperate cry, Neil ran. The mountain's roar echoed in his ears, but no matter how fast he ran, no matter how far he went, the mountain pulled him back. His surroundings blurred, and the mist seemed to close in, suffocating him with its cold embrace. No one ever found Neil or his team again. Years later, the area where the stone circle had once stood was found buried under an avalanche. No trace of the climbers, no sign of the altar, nothing was left. The mountain had swallowed it all, leaving behind only the whispers of those who had come before. The locals still tell the tale of the vanishing climbers and the mountain's curse that waits for those foolish enough to challenge it. It is said that once you hear the whispers of Mount Hotham, it's already too late. The mountain is alive, and it will claim you, body and soul, before you ever leave. Story 3. Mount Azrael, a towering, jagged peak in the remote part of the Andes, was known to few yet revered by many. It stood as an almost mythical figure among the locals in the nearby villages, its snow-covered summit casting an ominous shadow over the land. For centuries, rumors had swirled around the mountain. Locals spoke in hushed tones of the ancient spirits that roamed the peaks, of the strange sounds heard at night, and of the souls lost in its unforgiving terrain. In 1997, a seasoned expedition team led by renowned mountaineer Marcus Donovan arrived at the base of Mount Azrael. The team consisted of 6 climbers: Marcus, an experienced guide; Lucas, a geologist; Amy, a photographer; Sarah, a survival expert; and the 2 youngest climbers, Jack and Tom. They were a tightly knit team, eager to summit the nearly 21,000-foot peak, something few had managed to do due to its treacherous conditions. But Marcus had heard the rumors too, the whispering, winds, the strange disappearances, and he believed that the mountain's mystery was something that could be conquered with the right preparation. Little did he know that what awaited them would not only break their spirits, but alter the very course of their lives. The journey began with excitement and enthusiasm, as they trekked through thick forests and icy ravines, making steady progress. However, as they began to ascend the lower slopes of Mount Azrael, they encountered something unsettling. Every few hours they would hear a faint sound, like a soft whisper carried by the wind. At first, they chalked it up to the altitude and the biting cold. But as the whispers grew clearer, Marcus couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. The sounds were not just wind. They were voices. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat around the campfire, listening to the eerie sounds coming from the surrounding mountainside. "Probably just the wind," Lucas replied, trying to mask the tension in his voice. But Amy, the photographer, wasn't convinced. "No, this is different. It's like they're talking, but not to us." The whispers became louder over the following days, growing more distinct, more urgent. One night, as the group lay in their tents, Marcus swore he heard someone calling his name from the dark expanse of the mountain. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, calling to him specifically, from the blackness outside their camp. The next morning, Jack, one of the younger climbers, was found missing. His sleeping bag was untouched, and his gear was still by the fire, but he was nowhere to be found. The team searched for hours, but no trace of him could be found. As they combed through the wilderness, the only thing they could hear was the whispering wind. "Jack?" Marcus called out into the vast emptiness. "Jack, where are you?" But the only response was the wind's soft moan, a murmur that sounded eerily like Jack's name. Panic set in. They called for a rescue, but the snowstorm that began the next day cut them off from the rest of the world. The team was stranded and the temperature plummeted to life-threatening lows. Their food supplies were dwindling, and they were left with no choice but to press forward, if not for the missing Jack, then for their own survival. Days turned into a blur of cold, hunger, and fear, but the worst was yet to come. On the 5th day, the team set up camp on a narrow ledge high up the mountain, just below the summit. The wind howled fiercely, but the whispering voices had grown even stronger. They were no longer distant or faint. They were close, all around them, and they seemed to echo from the very rocks themselves. That night, after an exhausting day of climbing, Marcus heard the voice again, his name. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just a whisper. It was urgent, desperate, like a warning. "Marcus!" He bolted upright in his tent, heart pounding in his chest. He thought it was Sarah calling to him. But when he rushed outside, there was no one there. Only the howling wind, carrying with it a new sound, a low growl coming from the heart of the mountain. The others were still asleep, undisturbed by the strange sounds, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He decided to investigate. He climbed further up the narrow path, following the sound of the voice. As he rounded a jagged cliffside, he stopped dead in his tracks. Before him stood a strange figure, shrouded in the thick mist that had rolled in unexpectedly. The figure was tall, draped in a long, tattered cloak that seemed to blend with the mountain itself. Its face was obscured by a shadow, but Marcus could feel its eyes upon him, cold, unblinking, and filled with ancient sorrow. "You should not have come here," the figure spoke, its voice hollow and distant. Marcus felt his heart freeze. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking with fear. "I am the guardian of this mountain," the figure replied, its voice like the wind itself, ancient and untouchable. "I have watched over this place for centuries, and I have seen many come, and many more vanish. The mountain will take you all." The figure stepped forward, and Marcus took an involuntary step back. His gaze fell upon the ground at its feet, and he saw what appeared to be the frozen bodies of previous climbers, horribly twisted, their eyes wide open in frozen terror, their faces locked in a final, silent scream. Suddenly, the figure was gone, vanishing into the mist as though it had never been there. Marcus stood, trembling, his heart pounding, his mind racing. "Marcus!" came Sarah's voice, faint but frantic. He turned to find her and the others rushing toward him. They had followed him, but when they reached him, Marcus couldn't speak. His throat felt dry, his tongue too heavy to form words. He could only point to the ledge where the figure had been. "What's wrong?" Lucas asked, looking around nervously. It's real," Marcus whispered, barely able to speak. "The mountain, it's alive." Before they could react, the ground beneath them trembled. A low rumble echoed through the mountain, like the earth itself was shifting. A deep, dark shadow loomed from the summit above, as if the mountain was waking from a long, cursed slumber. In an instant, the ground gave way. The team fell, sliding down the steep slope as the rocks around them shattered. They tumbled into a deep, narrow chasm, the mountain groaning like a living beast in pain. The last thing Marcus saw before the world went black was a single, pale hand reaching up from the depths, a hand that looked like it had been reaching, for him, for centuries. The next morning, when a search party finally reached the area, there was no sign of Marcus and his team. No bodies, no equipment, only the whispering winds that had claimed so many before them. Locals who had ventured close to the mountain in the days following spoke of strange, unsettling sounds coming from the peaks, whispers that carried on the wind, voices that warned them to stay away. The villagers grew quiet, afraid to even speak of the cursed mountain. And so Mount Azrael remained, silent, ominous, and waiting. The whispers would return, they knew, to whoever was brave, or foolish, enough to seek its summit again. Months passed since the disappearance of Marcus and his team on Mount Azrael. The village at the base of the mountain returned to its quiet routine, but the shadow of what had happened lingered in the air. The whispering winds that had drawn Marcus and his team to the mountain still carried through the village, a constant reminder of the curse that haunted the peaks. But there were always those who, driven by curiosity or the desire to conquer the unknown, would return to the mountain, seeking the answers that others dared not ask. In 1998, a new expedition set its sights on Mount Azrael. This group was different. They had heard the stories, yes, but they were experienced mountaineers and explorers who believed that no mountain was beyond their reach. Led by a man named Victor Alvarez, a veteran of several high-altitude expeditions, the team consisted of 4 others: Ana, a historian with an interest in ancient cultures; Daniel, a seasoned mountaineer; Javier, a local guide familiar with the mountain's treacherous paths; and Gabriela, a scientist who specialized in geology. Victor, though intrigued by the legends surrounding the mountain, dismissed them as the product of superstition. He believed that the mountain had claimed its victims due to their lack of preparation and respect for the harsh conditions. The whispers were nothing more than the wind, he told his team, nothing more than natural phenomena that had been exaggerated by fearful locals. They set out on their expedition with confidence, determined to reach the summit of Mount Azrael and document their achievement. The early days of their journey were uneventful. The weather was clear, and their progress was steady. But as they began to approach the higher, more treacherous slopes, the atmosphere began to change. The temperature dropped unexpectedly, and the clouds overhead thickened, casting a pall over the mountain. One night, as they camped near the tree line, Ana came across a strange artifact, a broken stone tablet half buried in the snow. It was engraved with symbols that were unfamiliar to her, but they seemed old, older than anything she had encountered in her studies. The tablet's surface was worn, its edges smooth from years of exposure to the elements. As she examined it, a shiver ran down her spine. There was something unsettling about the symbols, something she couldn't quite place. "This doesn't look like anything from the local cultures," Ana remarked, showing the tablet to Victor. "These symbols, they seem older. This could be evidence of something ancient, something lost." Victor was dismissive. "It's probably just an old relic from a past civilization. People have been climbing these mountains for centuries. This could be nothing." But the tablet seemed to weigh heavily on Ana's mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to something much darker than just a forgotten artifact. As they continued their ascent, the whispers began to grow louder. At first, the team attributed it to the howling wind, but as the days wore on, they could no longer ignore the distinct, almost human quality to the sound. It was as if voices were calling out to them from the fog, whispers that sounded too deliberate to be natural. One evening, as they huddled in their tents, Daniel spoke up. "Have any of you felt like you're being watched? Like something is following us?" The others exchanged uneasy glances. Javier, the guide, was the first to respond. "I've heard the stories, too. The mountain does strange things to people. The whispers, they're not just the wind. Something is calling us. But what? I don't know." That night, Gabriela couldn't sleep. The whispers were louder than ever, and the chill in the air was almost unbearable. She stepped out of the tent for a moment of relief, hoping that the cold night air might help clear her mind. But as she looked out into the darkness, she saw something that froze her in place. A figure. It was standing at the edge of their campsite, just beyond the reach of the firelight. The figure was tall and slender, draped in a dark cloak that blended with the shadows. Gabriela's heart raced as she stared at the figure, her breath catching in her throat. It didn't move. It didn't speak. But somehow, she knew it was watching her. She backed away slowly, her eyes never leaving the figure. When she returned to the safety of the tent, she tried to explain what she had seen, but none of the others had witnessed it. They dismissed her story as a product of exhaustion or nerves. But Gabriela couldn't shake the image of the shadowy figure, its empty gaze fixed on her. The next morning, things took a darker turn. Javier, the guide, was missing. His tent was empty, and his gear had been left behind. The others searched the area around their camp, but there was no trace of him. No footprints in the snow, no sign of a struggle. It was as if he had simply vanished into the night. The team was on edge, but Victor was determined to press on. "We can't afford to turn back. We need to reach the summit. We came all this way." But even as he said the words, he didn't believe them himself. Something had shifted in the mountain, something they couldn't understand. And the whispers were growing louder, more insistent. As they climbed higher, Anna began to notice something strange. The mountain seemed to be changing around them. The path they had taken earlier had vanished, replaced by an unfamiliar route. The cliffs they had passed just hours before were now inaccessible, and the rocks that had seemed solid now appeared to shift, moving like sand beneath their feet. The landscape was warping, as though the mountain itself was altering its form. They were no longer climbing a mountain. They were trapped inside it. That night, they camped near a strange rock formation, a ring of stone pillars, eerily similar to the one Marcus and his team had found. As they sat around the fire, the temperature dropped further, and the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. They could no longer ignore them. The voices were not just the wind, they were coming from the mountain itself. Victor stood up, his face pale. "We have to leave, now." But as he turned to gather his things, he saw it. The figure from the night before, standing at the edge of the camp. This time, it wasn't just one figure. There were others emerging from the shadows, their forms shifting in the mist. They were tall, their faces obscured, but their eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. "Victor," Anna whispered, her voice trembling. "What are they?" The figures did not respond. Instead, they moved toward the team, their movements slow but deliberate. The whispers grew louder, filling their minds with an overwhelming sense of dread. The ground beneath them trembled, and the very air seemed to pulse with an ancient, malevolent force. In that moment, the realization hit them all. The mountain was not just alive, it was conscious, and it had been waiting for them. One by one, the climbers began to vanish, swallowed by the mountain's dark embrace. Anna was the first to disappear, her scream echoing in the night as she was pulled into the fog. Daniel followed, his body twisted, unnaturally as he was dragged away by invisible hands. Gabriela was next, her eyes wide with terror as she was pulled toward the ring of stones, her body writhing in agony. Victor was left alone, the last one standing. He ran, stumbling through the fog, desperate to escape, but the whispers followed him, growing louder, more insistent. He could hear his name being called, not by the others, but by something far older, far more ancient. The last thing he saw before he lost consciousness was the figure, the one from the night before, standing before him, its empty eyes locked onto his, its mouth opening to speak words that he could not understand. When the rescue team arrived days later, they found nothing. No sign of the climbers, no footprints, no bodies. Only the whispering wind, carrying the echoes of those who had been lost to the mountain. Some say that Mount Azrael has claimed many more souls than anyone knows. That the mountain is a living entity, a guardian of some forgotten power, waiting for the next unwitting explorers to wander into its grasp. And those who hear the whispers are never seen again. The disappearance of Victor Alvarez and his team was met with the same hushed fear that had surrounded the stories of Mount Azrael for generations. The local villagers who lived in the shadow of the mountain spoke little of it afterward, their eyes always shifting toward the distant peaks with a mixture of reverence and terror. Over time, the search for the missing climbers was abandoned, and Mount Azrael slowly faded from the public consciousness, at least for those who dared not look too closely. But there are those who can never forget. In 2003, a small group of mountaineers led by an investigator named Naomi Vargas arrived at the base of Mount Azrael. Naomi had heard the stories of the whispering winds, of the lost souls, and of the team of climbers who had vanished without a trace. But she was different. She wasn't like the others who had ventured to the mountain with hopes of conquering it. Naomi had spent her life studying the inexplicable, seeking to understand phenomena that others deemed supernatural. Her desire was not to climb the mountain, but to unravel the mystery of the mountain itself, to bring answers to the families who had lost loved ones, and to the many who still whispered about the malevolent force that lived there. Naomi was not alone. She brought with her a small but experienced team: Rob, a seasoned mountaineer; Elsa, a geologist who had been studying seismic activity in the region; Felix, a camera operator documenting their journey for a documentary on unexplained phenomena; and Lara, a survivor of a previous mountaineering accident, who had lost her own family members in the 1997 expedition, the one led by Marcus Donovan. Lara had grown up hearing the horror stories about Mount Azrael, and had once believed that they were simply myths. But her experience with the tragic loss of her family on the mountain made her want answers. She, too, had heard the whispers in her nightmares, the same ones that had plagued her before she found out the truth about Marcus and his team. And now, with Naomi's team, she hoped to uncover what had truly happened. They arrived at the base of the mountain, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that this journey would not be like any other. The wind howled through the trees, and the sky was a dull, oppressive gray. Naomi could feel it, an ancient presence in the air, something that was waiting for them. The first few days of their journey up the mountain seemed like any other expedition. They made good time, following the path that had been charted by previous climbers, though. Naomi couldn't shake the eerie feeling that the mountain was closing in around them, its silence growing deeper with each passing hour. As they climbed higher, the fog thickened and the temperature dropped. And then, on the fourth night, the whispering started. It was faint at first, like the wind shifting through the trees. But as they sat in their camp, the whispers grew louder, clearer. It wasn't just the wind, it was voices. Soft, mournful voices, distant but close enough to send shivers down their spines. They were calling to them, each voice sounding like a familiar name. Naomi. The wind carried her name, but not just her name. It felt wrong. There was something off about it, as if the mountain itself knew her. Elsa, came the next voice, almost in a pleading tone. It wasn't just one voice. The voices of the lost climbers, the ones who had never returned, filled the air, each one calling out for help, each one reaching out from the cold abyss. Rob, the mountaineer, was the first to speak. "It's just the wind. We've been climbing for days. Our minds are tired. We're hearing things." But Naomi wasn't so sure. The voices weren't just in their heads. They were coming from somewhere, from the heart of the mountain itself. And then, the earth began to tremble. At first, it was a subtle shake, almost imperceptible, but as the night grew darker, the tremors became more pronounced. The ground beneath their feet shuddered violently, and the fog swirled around them in unnatural patterns. The whispers grew louder, now clearly a chorus of tortured souls, calling from deep within the mountain. "We have to leave," Naomi said, her voice urgent. "We need to get out of here, now." But it was too late. The mountain had already claimed them. Felix, who had been filming the entire expedition, turned to his camera, only to find that the screen flickered with a strange static. The footage distorted, as if the very nature of reality was bending around them. And then, something more terrifying appeared in the frame, a tall, shadowy figure standing at the edge of their camp, its face obscured by the darkness. It moved closer, its form fluid and indistinct, like smoke rising from the ground. "Run!" Rob shouted. But before anyone could move, the figure raised a hand, and the ground beneath them split open. In an instant, the team was plunged into the earth, falling through a chasm that seemed to open up beneath their feet. Naomi reached out, grabbing Lara's arm as they both fell into the darkness, the rest of the team lost to the abyss. The fall seemed endless. The darkness closed in around them, swallowing all light, until they landed with a sickening thud. When Naomi opened her eyes, she found herself in a vast cavern, the walls slick with moisture. The air was thick and heavy, as if the very atmosphere had weight. They were no longer on the mountain. They were in its heart. The shadows moved around them, their forms shifting in the dim light, their faces twisted in agony. The whispers were louder now, deafening, as though they were inside her mind. And then, standing before her, was the figure. Its face was a black void, its eyes two gleaming points of light, like twin stars burning in the darkness. "You have disturbed the balance," the figure spoke, its voice deep and resonant, echoing through the cavern. "This mountain is not a place for the living. It is a prison for those who dare to seek its secrets." Naomi tried to speak, but no words came out. The figure raised a hand, and she felt herself being drawn toward it, her body moving against her will. "You will join the others," it whispered, its voice now 1,000 voices. "The forgotten ones." Naomi fought against the pull, but the mountain was too powerful. The figure reached out, its cold fingers grazing her skin. She could feel herself slipping away, losing herself to the void, the whispers in her ears growing louder, pulling her into the mountain's embrace. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. The next morning, the villagers at the base of Mount Azrael found the remains of Naomi's team. Their bodies were lying in a strange, unnatural position, their eyes wide open, as though they had seen something too horrifying to comprehend. No trace of their equipment, no footprints, no sign of their last moments remained. Only the wind whispered through the trees. The mountain had claimed them all, just as it had claimed so many before. The villagers whispered the stories of the cursed mountain, but none dared speak its name aloud. They knew that Mount Azrael was not just a peak, but a living entity, hungry for the souls of those who sought to conquer it. And so the whispers continued, carried on the wind that blew through the valleys, calling to anyone foolish enough to listen. For as long as the mountain stood, its secrets would remain buried, and the lost souls within it would wait, forever calling, forever waiting for the next to come.